The blade was already rising when Murak Ashwalker heard the laugh. She had her opponent on his knees in the frozen mud of the dueling circle, his sword knocked 20 feet into a snowbank, his nose broken and streaming red onto the pale ground. The crowd of trappers and drovers ringing the circle had gone hoarse from shouting her name, half of them betting silver they did not have on how many heartbeats it would take her to finish him. Her curved falchion was already coming down in the killing arc, her arm corded with muscle beneath the sleeve of her fitted leather armor, when a laugh rang out from the back of the crowd. It was not a loud laugh. It was not even meant for her. It was the low, warm, unguarded laugh of a man who found something genuinely funny and did not care who heard it, a laugh she had heard exactly once before in her life, 3 winters past, over a shared fire and a bowl of burnt stew in a supply shack half buried in snow. Her blade stopped an inch from the kneeling man's throat. The crowd fell silent, confused by the sudden stillness where blood should have sprayed. Murak did not look at the man beneath her sword. She was scanning the crowd, her golden eyes narrowing beneath the dark slashes of her brows, searching for the source of that sound the way a wolf searches for the scent that means home. She found him near the fence rail, half hidden behind a fur-wrapped drover twice his width, a slight, sandy-bearded man in a patched wool coat with salt stains crusted white along the hem, laughing at some joke his companion had made, utterly unaware that he had just saved a stranger's life without knowing it. Matthew Boone, 3 years older than the last time she had seen him, a little more weathered around the eyes, but that laugh had not changed at all. "Get up," Murak said to the man on the ground, sheathing her falchion with a motion so fast the crowd barely registered it. "You fought well enough to keep your teeth. Go home." The crowd erupted in confused protest, several men who had bet on blood demanding their coin back. But Murak was already walking, shouldering through the press of furs and wool, her eyes fixed on the man by the fence who had not yet noticed her at all. The outpost of Kelder's Rest sat at the mouth of the Ashgrave Pass, the last true settlement before the mountain trails climbed into Orc territory and the salt flats beyond. And in the deep of winter, the sun barely cleared the peaks before sinking again, leaving most of the day the color of old iron. It was a place built for hard men and harder trade, log walls reinforced with stone, a single muddy street lined with a trading post, a smithy, a tannery, and the Crooked Antler, the only tavern for 60 miles that served something warmer than melted snow. Matthew Boone had been coming through Kelder's Rest for 6 years, ever since he had taken over his late uncle's spice and salt trade, hauling sacks of precious salt north to the Orc clans who could not mine their own from the frozen ground, and hauling back furs, worked leather, and the strange, sweet resin the clan healers pressed from mountain pine, which fetched a fine price in the southern cities. It was dangerous work. The pass belonged to no one and everyone, prowled by raiders both human and orc, and more than one trader had gone up the Ashgrave with a full wagon and never come down at all. He had met Murak Ashwalker on his second run north, when his wagon axle had cracked in a whiteout, and he had been 3 days from freezing to death in a supply shack with nothing but a thin fire and a sack of oats, and she had kicked the door open with her boot, filled the doorway with her broad-shouldered 6.5-foot frame, and looked at him the way a woman looks at something she has decided. In that instant, she will not allow to die. She had not asked his name. She had simply built up his fire properly, boiled his oats into something edible, and sat across from him through the worst of the storm, saying almost nothing, watching him with those strange gold eyes that seemed to catch the firelight and hold it. When he had finally worked up the nerve to make a joke about his own uselessness with an axle wrench, she had laughed, a short bark of surprise, as if she had not expected to find anything about him funny, and something in her face had changed after that, softened at the edges in a way he did not understand until much later. They had spent 3 days together in that shack before the storm broke, and when it did, she had helped him fix the axle with her bare hands, bending iron he could not have bent with a hammer, And then she had walked off into the white without a word of farewell, leaving him standing in the trail with his heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in his chest. He had asked after her in every outpost since. No one had known her name. Some had claimed there was no such orc woman traveling alone in that country, that he must have dreamed her up out of cold and desperation. He had begun, in his darker moments, to believe them. Now she was walking toward him through a crowd that parted around her the way water parts around a rock, and Matthew Boone, spice trader, 31 years old, unmarried, was laughing at something his friend Corwin had said about a mule, and did not see her coming until her shadow fell across him. "You," Murex said. Matthew turned, and the laugh died in his throat, not from fear, but from the sheer force of finally seeing something he had begun to think he had invented. "I know you," he said stupidly, because it was the only thing his mouth would produce. "You are lucky you laughed when you did," she said. "I was about to open a man's throat." Corwin, who had gone very pale, took several steps backward and found urgent business at the other end of the fence. Matthew looked past her, at the kneeling man being helped up by two friends, at the dispersing crowd still muttering about lost wagers, and understood slowly what he had just interrupted. "You were going to kill him. He challenged me. He lost. That is the custom." She said it flatly, without apology, but her gold eyes had not left his face since she'd stopped in front of him, and there was something searching in them, something that did not match the coldness of her words. "You laughed. I heard it." "I have not heard that laugh since a supply shack in a whiteout 3 winters gone." "I've been looking for you," Matthew said, and then flushed, because it sounded desperate even to his own ears. "I mean," I asked, "everywhere I went, nobody knew you." "I do not give my name to strangers," Murex said. "You were not a stranger. You were the fool who could not fix his own axle." "That fool has fixed a great many axles since," Matthew said, and something in the corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough that his chest ached with the sight of it. "Murak Ashwalker," she said, "since you have earned the asking." "Matthew Boone." "I know," she said. "I asked too." That admission seemed to cost her something. A flicker of vulnerability crossing features built for war, and Matthew felt the ground tilt slightly beneath him, the way it does when a man realizes the thing he wanted most in the world has, against every likelihood, wanted him back. They stood there in the churned mud of the dueling circle while the last of the crowd dispersed, the man Murak had spared limping away with his friends, muttering about orc mercy being a stranger thing than orc violence, and neither of them moved to close the distance between them, though both of them wanted to. "You are still hauling salt through the pass," she said. "It was not a question. Someone has to. The clans up past Greyfang Ridge haven't had a proper trade caravan reach them in 2 months. Last 3 traders who tried turned back or didn't come back at all." Matthew rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm leaving in 4 days. Full wagon. It's a fool's errand, and everyone at the trading post has told me so." "Then you will die on the road," Murex said, "unless someone who is not a fool goes with you." Matthew's heart was hammering so hard he was certain she could hear it. "Are you offering?" "I am telling you," Murex said, "that I am going." The crooked antler was warmer than the street, if only barely, its low log rafters strung with dried herbs and the carcasses of winter hares, its single stone hearth throwing more smoke than heat into a room crowded with drovers, trappers, and the 2 or 3 merchants foolish or desperate enough to still be running the pass this deep into the season. Matthew bought 2 mugs of the spiced ale the tavern was known for, and carried them to the corner table where Murak had settled, folding her long frame onto a bench clearly built for smaller bodies, her knees nearly to her chest, her falchion laid across her lap with the ease of a woman who had never once in her life been without a weapon within reach. She wore fitted leather armor, dark and oiled, cinched tight at the waist with a wide belt that emphasized the powerful line of her hips. The leather stretched over broad shoulders, and a chest that made more than one man in the tavern glance twice before remembering the wisdom of looking elsewhere. Her tusks were small, more suggestion than threat, curving just past her lower lip, and her skin was a deep mossy green, weathered by wind and sun, marked along one forearm with the pale lines of old scars she wore like a ledger of survived violence. Her black hair was bound back in a thick braid that fell past her shoulder blades, and when she reached for the mug Matthew slid toward her, he watched the muscles in her forearm shift beneath the skin and thought, absurdly, that he had never in his life seen anything so beautiful. "Why are you here?" she asked. "In Kelder's Rest, this late in the season, if half your trading post thinks you a fool for going north." "'Cause if I don't go, the clans past Greyfang Ridge don't eat salt this winter, and salt isn't a luxury up there. It's what keeps their meat from spoiling and their wounds from rotting. And because," he added more quietly, "if I stop taking the risk, I stop being able to look at myself in a shaving mirror." Murak studied him for a long moment over the rim of her mug. "That is either very brave or very stupid. My uncle used to say there wasn't much difference between the two most days." "Your uncle sounds wise. He froze to death in a ditch 2 winters before I took over his trade, so I'd call that debatable." Matthew said it without bitterness, the old grief long since worn smooth, and Murak's expression did something complicated, something that looked almost like respect. "You have no wife," she said. It was, again, not quite a question, though there was a careful weight to how she said it, as if the answer mattered more than she wanted it to. "No," Matthew admitted. "Never had the coin to court properly, and never had much luck at it besides. Most women in the border towns want a man who's home more than he's gone, and I'm gone more often than I'm home." "A waste," Murak said, "of a good laugh." Matthew nearly choked on his ale. "Is that a compliment, Murak Ashwalker?" "It is an observation." But there was warmth in her golden eyes that belied the flatness of her tone, and Matthew felt that warmth settle somewhere deep in his chest, a coal banked against the cold he had been carrying since a whiteout 3 winters gone. "Why does an orc woman duel for sport in a human outpost?" he asked, because he had been wondering it since he'd seen her sword stop an inch from a man's throat. "You could be back with your clan. Warm tents, your own people." Something shuddered behind her eyes, quick and final as a door closing. "My clan and I do not agree on many things. I left 3 years past. I have made my own way since, and dueling pays better than most trades open to an orc woman who wishes to remain her own master." She said it in a tone that closed the subject as firmly as she had closed her expression, and Matthew, who had learned patience the hard way over years of long, silent mountain roads, did not push. "Well," he said instead, "I'm glad you were mastering yourself in this particular outpost, on this particular night." That finally earned him a real smile, brief and startling, white teeth and small tusks and golden eyes crinkling at the corners, and Matthew thought his heart might simply stop in his chest from the sight of it. They talked long into the night, the tavern emptying around them, until only the 2 of them and the tavern keeper dozing behind the bar remained. And by the time Matthew walked back to the trading post's guest room where he'd been sleeping on sacks of unsold salt, he had told Murak Ashwalker more about his life than he had told any living soul in years. And she had told him, in careful, measured pieces, enough about hers that he understood she had left more than a clan behind 3 years ago. She had left a version of herself she no longer wished to be. He did not sleep much that night. He lay on his sacks of salt staring at the low rafters and thought about gold eyes and a laugh that had stopped a killing blade, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that was not quite loneliness. The 4 days before departure passed in a blur of preparation, and Matthew found himself, more often than not, in Murak's company. She helped him check the wagon's axles with hands that could crack iron, testing each bolt and joint with a thoroughness that put his own inspection to shame. She helped him load the sacks of salt and the small chests of dried spice, hefting weight that would have taken 2 ordinary men, and when he protested that she needn't do a laborer's work, she had simply looked at him and said, "I'm not doing a laborer's work. I am ensuring the wagon that carries you north does not fall apart on a mountain trail," which was not, he noted, quite the same thing as an admission of care, but was close enough to warm him regardless. On the second evening, walking back from the trading post through the early dark, she had stopped him with a hand on his arm, her grip strong enough to bruise but gentle in its intent, and said, "There is a raiding band. Half-orc renegades, half-human deserters working the upper pass since the first snows. They took a caravan from Millhaven 3 weeks back, killed the drovers, kept the goods." She'd watched his face carefully as she said it, as if measuring whether the news would send him running from the whole endeavor. "If we go north, we will likely cross paths with them." "Then I suppose it's good you're coming," Matthew had said, and meant it entirely, and something in Murak's shoulders had eased at his answer, as if she had expected him to balk and was relieved, deeply relieved, that he had not. "You are not afraid of me," she said then, an odd observation to make of a man who had spent 3 days alone with her once already and had spent every day since seeking her out. "No," Matthew said. "Should I be? Most men are. Most humans, when they first see me, see only what I could do to them if I chose." "I saw what you did for me," Matthew said quietly, "in that supply shack 3 years back. You didn't have to stay through that storm. You didn't have to fix my axle. You could have walked on and left me to freeze, and no one would have ever known or blamed you for it. That's what I see when I look at you, Murak. Not what you could do, what you have done." She said nothing for a long moment, her golden eyes bright in the dusk, and then, without warning, she closed the distance between them and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of a woman who had decided something and did not believe in half measures, her hand coming up to cup the back of his skull, her mouth hard and hungry against his. And Matthew, startled into stillness for only a heartbeat, wrapped his arms around what he could reach of her powerful frame and kissed her back with everything 3 years of wondering had built up in him. When she finally pulled back, both of them breathing hard in the cold air, she looked almost as surprised as he felt. "I have wanted to do that," she admitted, "since the whiteout." "You might have mentioned it sooner," Matthew said, a little breathlessly, and she laughed, that same short bark of surprised delight he had first heard 3 years ago, and it was, he thought, the finest sound in the whole cold world. "I do not mention things I am not certain of," Murak said. "I am certain now." They left Kelder's Rest 4 days later at first light, the wagon loaded heavy with salt and spice, Matthew driving the mule team while Murak rode a shaggy mountain pony beside him, her falchion at her hip, and a heavy bow slung across her back that she had purchased from the trading post smith with coins she refused to let Matthew contribute toward. The trading post's owner, a stout balding man named Havard who had known Matthew for 6 years, had watched them depart with open skepticism. "An orc riding shotgun on a salt run," he had said, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see the day. You sure about this, Boone?" "More sure than I've been about anything in years," Matthew had answered, and meant it. The road north climbed steadily out of Kelder's Rest, following the frozen ribbon of the Ashgrave River through stands of black pine bent double under snow, the mountains rising on either side like the walls of some vast forgotten fortress. The days were short and brutally cold, the sun a pale disk that barely cleared the peaks before sinking again into premature dusk, and Matthew was grateful beyond words for Murak's presence beside the wagon, not merely for the safety her strength provided, but for the company that had, in 3 short years, come to feel like the missing half of something he had not known was broken. They made camp the first night in the lee of a rock outcropping, Murak building the fire with an efficiency that put Matthew's own woodcraft to shame, and as they sat close together beneath a shared fur blanket, sharing a bowl of the same burnt but edible stew that had first brought them together, Matthew found himself laughing at something she said, and she looked at him with an expression so soft, so unguarded that he nearly forgot to breathe. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I am only glad that I recognized that laugh in the circle, that I stopped my blade in time to hear it again." "I'm glad, too," Matthew said, and reached across the shared bowl to take her hand, and she let him, her calloused fingers curling around his with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything he knew of her strength, and yet somehow was not at odds at all, because he had learned in a very short time that Murak Ashwalker's gentleness and her strength came from the very same place. The second day brought the first sign of trouble: wagon tracks in the snow, 3 sets, veering off the main trail toward a narrow side canyon and no tracks coming back out. Murak dismounted to examine them, her expression grim. "Millhaven caravan," she said, "or what is left of it. This is old, though." "A week, maybe more." "Should we look?" Matthew asked, though he already dreaded the answer. "No," Murak said. "There is nothing to find that will help the dead, and much that might hurt us if the raiders left watchers. We keep moving." They kept moving, but the mood between them had sobered, and Matthew found himself watching the tree line more carefully, his hand never far from the hatchet he kept beneath the wagon seat, though he knew well enough it would do little against determined raiders. It was on the 4th day, deep in the narrowest stretch of the pass, where the trail threaded between 2 towering rock faces barely wide enough for the wagon, that they found the checkpoint. It was not a formal checkpoint, nothing so official as that, but a rope strung between 2 posts driven into the frozen ground, and behind it, a dozen men and orcs both, ragged and hard-eyed, weapons drawn, watching the approaching wagon with the particular hunger of people who had eaten poorly for a long time and had found, at last, something worth taking. "Renegades," Murak said quietly, reining her pony alongside the wagon. "Stop here. Let me speak first." The leader of the band, a broad human man with a scarred face and a rusted longsword, stepped forward as the wagon halted, his eyes moving over the salt sacks with open greed. "That is a fine haul for a man traveling with only an orc for guard," he called out. "Hand it over peaceful, and we let you keep your wagon and your life. Might even let you keep your orc if she is willing to be reasonable about it." "The salt is not yours to take," Murak said, dismounting slowly, her hand resting on the hilt of her falchion but not yet drawing it. "It is bound for the clans past Greyfang Ridge. Take it, and you starve people who have already lost too much this winter." "Not my concern," the leader said, grinning to show several missing teeth. 10 of us, 1 orc and a salt merchant. Numbers favor us plain enough." Matthew's heart was pounding, his hand tight on the hatchet handle, but he kept his voice steady when he spoke. "You don't want this fight. Whatever you think you know about fighting 1 orc woman, you don't know enough." Several of the raiders laughed, but the leader's smile faltered, just slightly, as his eyes flicked to Murak's stance, to the easy readiness in her powerful frame, to something in her golden eyes that spoke of violence weathered and survived many times over. "Big talk from a salt trader," the leader said, but there was less certainty in it now. "Last warning," Murak said. "Stand aside or learn why I no longer count the men I have killed trying to take what is not theirs." The leader hesitated 1 heartbeat too long, and then made the mistake of gesturing his men forward. What followed happened faster than Matthew could properly track, a blur of motion in the narrow canyon, Murak's falchion clearing its sheath in a silver arc, her body moving with a speed that seemed impossible for someone of her size, closing the distance to the nearest raider before he had fully raised his weapon. She did not kill him, Matthew would realize later, examining the aftermath with a trader's habit of counting losses. She struck with the flat and the pommel, breaking bones rather than spilling life, moving through the raiders like a force of nature rather than a woman, disarming, dropping, cracking ribs and wrists with brutal, controlled efficiency. Matthew, for his part, kept the mule team steady with 1 hand and swung the hatchet with the other when a raider came at the wagon from the flank, catching the man's blade on the haft and shoving hard enough to send him stumbling back into the snow, where Murak finished the fight for him with a boot to the man's temple that left him crumpled and unmoving but breathing. In under 2 minutes, it was over. 6 raiders lay groaning or unconscious in the churned snow. 4 more had fled into the rocks. The leader himself lay flat on his back, Murak's boot planted firmly on his chest, her falchion point resting light as a whisper against the soft skin of his throat. "I have let you live," Murak said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the canyon, so that you may tell every other band foolish enough to prey on this pass what happened here today. The trader beside me is under my protection. Anyone who touches him or the goods he carries will answer to me personally, and I promise you, I will not be so merciful the second time. She removed her boot. The leader scrambled up and fled without another word, dragging one of his groaning companions with him, and the canyon fell quiet again, the only sound the wind whistling between the rock faces and the ragged breathing of the men left behind in the snow. Matthew climbed down from the wagon, his legs unsteady with the aftershock of violence witnessed up close, and found Murak wiping her falchion clean on a scrap of cloth, her expression calm, almost bored as if she had done nothing more taxing than chop firewood. "You're not hurt," he said, needing to confirm it with his own eyes, running his hands briefly over her arms, her shoulders, checking for wounds she might dismiss out of pride. "I am not hurt," she confirmed, and something in her face softened at the worry in his. "You are shaking." "I've never seen anything like that," Matthew admitted. "I've heard stories. I didn't believe half of them." "Believe them now," Murak said, but not unkindly, and then, more gently, "I would not let them touch you, Matthew. Not while I have breath in me to prevent it." The words settled into his chest like a hand laid flat over a wound, easing something he had not fully realized ached. He pulled her into an embrace, careless of the drying blood on her leather armor, and she let him hold her, her powerful arms coming around him in turn, and they stood together in the aftermath of violence, breathing each other in, until the cold finally forced them back into motion. They pressed on, leaving the groaning raiders behind for their fled companions to collect, and made camp that night farther up the trail, both of them quieter than usual, the weight of what had nearly happened settling into the spaces between their words. "Why did you spare them?" Matthew asked eventually, as they sat close beside the fire. "Killing men who are only desperate and foolish is not the same as killing men who are truly cruel," Murak said. "I have done enough killing in my life to know the difference matters, even if the world does not always agree." She was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "My clan did not draw that line as carefully as I would have liked. It is one of the reasons I left them." "Will you tell me the rest of it?" Matthew asked. "Someday, why you left." "Someday," Murak agreed. "Not tonight. Tonight I only want to sit by this fire with you and not think of blood at all." He did not push further. He simply drew her closer beneath the shared fur, and she came willingly, resting her head against his shoulder despite the awkward difference in their height, and they sat that way until the fire burned low, saying nothing more, needing nothing more than the simple fact of each other's presence in the vast cold dark. They reached the outpost of Frost Hollow 6 days later, a rougher, smaller settlement than Kelder's Rest, built where the pass widened briefly before climbing again toward Greyfang Ridge, populated by a mix of human trappers and a handful of orcs who had settled among them in an uneasy, functional peace. It was here that Matthew had planned to resupply and rest the mule team before the final, most dangerous stretch of the journey, and it was here that the story's most shocking turn would take place, in the open square before nearly the whole settlement. News of Murak's reputation as a duelist had traveled faster than Matthew expected, carried by traders and trappers who had passed through Kelder's Rest, and by the time they arrived in Frost Hollow, a crowd had already gathered, drawn by rumor and the simple boredom of a long winter, eager to see if the tales were true. Among the crowd was a man named Brogan Steele, a local strongman known for winning every feat of strength contest the outpost had ever held, a mountain of a human nearly as tall as Murak herself, thick with muscle built from years of hauling timber and breaking ice for the settlement's water supply. Brogan had heard the stories of the orc woman who dueled and won, and pride, or perhaps simple drunken foolishness, had convinced him he could not let such a challenge pass unanswered. "You," Brogan called out as Matthew's wagon rolled into the square, pointing a thick finger at Murak. "I hear you fancy yourself unbeatable. I've broken the arm of every man foolish enough to challenge me in 5 years. Care to see how an orc fares?" The crowd, sensing spectacle, began to gather thicker, murmuring with excitement, some already shouting wagers. Murak dismounted slowly, studying Brogan with an expression of mild curiosity rather than concern. "I have no quarrel with you." "Then make one," Brogan said, grinning to the crowd's delight. "Or admit the stories are only stories and an orc woman is no match for a real man's strength." Matthew felt his stomach tighten with worry, not for Murak's safety, but for what might happen if this went too far, if pride on both sides pushed toward real violence in a settlement that was, ultimately, still wary of orcs walking freely among them. "Murak," he said quietly, "you don't have to prove anything to this fool." "I know," she said, not looking away from Brogan. "But he has made this a public matter, and if I walk away, every man in this square will believe an orc backs down from a human's challenge. That is not a story I wish traveling ahead of us into Greyfang territory, where our safety may depend on being taken seriously." She turned to Matthew, her expression softening just slightly. "This will not take long." The crowd cleared a rough circle in the square's packed snow, and someone produced a length of thick iron chain and a heavy wagon wheel axle, half buried in ice near the smithy, that had been the subject of local legend for years. An object so heavy that no man in Frost Hollow's history had managed to lift it clear of the ground, let alone hold it aloft. "A feat of strength, then, rather than blood," Brogan announced to the roaring approval of the crowd. "Whoever lifts the buried axle highest and holds it longest wins the boast. No weapons, no blood, just strength." Murak inclined her head in agreement, and Brogan, grinning with the confidence of a man who had never been beaten at this particular contest, stepped up first, digging the axle free from its icy grave with a pry bar before crouching, and with a roar that echoed off the surrounding buildings, hauling it up to his chest, arms shaking with effort, holding it there for a slow count of 10 before letting it drop with a thunderous crash, chest heaving, sweat steaming in the cold air. The crowd roared its approval, chanting his name, utterly certain the contest was already decided. Murak stepped forward without a word, without ceremony, without even removing her heavy fur cloak, and gripped the axle with both hands. What happened next would be spoken of in Frost Hollow for years afterward, told and retold until it took on the shape of legend even among those who had witnessed it firsthand. Murak lifted the axle not to her chest, as Brogan had, but clear overhead, arms fully extended, the massive iron bar held aloft as easily as a woman might lift a broom, her expression showing no strain at all, only a flat, level calm that was somehow more unsettling than any grimace of effort could have been. She held it there, arms steady as stone, for a count of 10, then 20, then 30, the crowd's roaring chants slowly dying into stunned, disbelieving silence, until the only sound in the square was the wind and the creak of the iron chain still dangling from one end of the axle. At the count of 60, she lowered the axle, not with a crash but with slow, deliberate control, setting it down into the snow as gently as if it weighed nothing at all, and straightened to her full height, looking not at Brogan, but out at the silent, gawking crowd that had, moments before, been howling for spectacle. No one spoke. No one cheered. Even Brogan, red-faced and heaving, stood frozen, staring at the axle in the snow as if it might explain to him what he had just witnessed. Murak turned to Matthew, and though her expression remained composed for the crowd, he caught the small, private flicker in her golden eyes meant only for him, a flash of something like humor at the sheer, stunned silence she had produced. "I believe," she said, loud enough for the whole square to hear. "That settles the matter." She walked back to the wagon without waiting for a response, and Matthew, fighting to keep the grin off his own face, followed her, the crowd parting in dead, awed silence around them both, no one daring to so much as murmur until they had passed. It was only once they had reached the small guest room Matthew had rented for the night, well away from the square and its stunned witnesses, that Murak finally allowed herself to laugh, that same short, delighted bark shaking her head. "His face," she said. "Did you see his face?" "I saw the whole square's face," Matthew said, laughing too, pulling her down onto the narrow bed beside him. "You could have warned me you were about to do that." "I did not know myself until he made his boast," Murak admitted. "But I am glad of it. Word will travel ahead of us now. No renegade band foolish enough to have heard the story will risk crossing an orc who lifted the Frost Hollow axle above her head without breaking a sweat." "Is that why you did it? Strategy?" Murak considered the question seriously for a moment, then shook her head. "No. I did it because a foolish man challenged me in front of a crowd, and I did not care to let him believe strength was something only men possessed." She reached up to touch the line of Matthew's jaw, her calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "And because you were watching, and I found in that moment that I wished to impress you more than I wished to avoid drawing attention. You've had my attention since a whiteout 3 years ago," Matthew said quietly. "You didn't need an axle for that." "I know," Murak said, "but it did not hurt either." He laughed, and she smiled, and the tension of the day's danger and spectacle dissolved into something warmer, something that had been building between them since the moment her blade had stopped an inch from a stranger's throat. And this time, when she kissed him, there was no hesitation in either of them, no uncertainty about what they both wanted. That night in the narrow guest room above Frost Hollow's quiet square, with the wind howling faintly against the shutters and the fire burned down to embers, Murak Ashwalker claimed Matthew Boone as thoroughly and unmistakably as she had claimed every battle she had ever fought, and he gave himself to her with the same willing, grateful surrender he had felt since the first moment her strange gold eyes had found him in that supply shack, 3 winters gone. It was not gentle, not entirely, for gentleness was not truly Murak's nature, but it was tender in the ways that mattered, careful of him even in its intensity. And when it was finished, she held him against her chest, his ear pressed to the steady drum of her heartbeat, and murmured something in the old orc tongue he did not understand but felt, somehow in the marrow of his bones, as a vow. "What does it mean?" he asked, drowsy and warm. "It means," Murak said softly, "that I have chosen you, in the way my people once chose mates before the wars, before the clans grew hard and cruel and forgot the old customs. It is not a thing said lightly, and it is not a thing unsaid once spoken." Matthew lifted his head to look at her, his heart suddenly pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with exertion. "Murak, I know what I am saying, Matthew Boone," she said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I have known since the dueling circle, when I heard your laugh and found I would rather live with the memory of it than kill a stranger to satisfy a crowd's bloodlust. I am not a woman who says such things without meaning them completely." "Then say it again," Matthew said, "in words I understand." "I choose you," Murak said simply, without ornament, the words landing in him with more weight than any poem could have carried. "I have chosen you. I will go on choosing you for as long as you will have me." "Forever, then," Matthew said, his voice rough with feeling. "That's how long I'll have you." She kissed him again, fierce and certain, and outside the shuttered window the long northern night stretched on, but for the first time in longer than Matthew could remember, he did not feel the cold at all. They stayed 2 more days in Frost Hollow, resupplying the wagon and resting the mule team, and in that time, word of the axle contest spread through the settlement like wildfire, transforming the wary, curious glances the townsfolk had first given Murak into something closer to respectful distance, occasionally even open admiration. Brogan Steele himself sought Matthew out on their second morning, sheepish and red-faced, to offer a rough apology. "Didn't mean disrespect," he mumbled, unable quite to meet Matthew's eyes. "Just pride talking is all. Your woman's got a strength on her I never seen the like of. Reckon I owe her better manners than I showed." "She'll accept the apology," Matthew said, "if you make it to her directly. She's not one for hearing things second-hand." Brogan found Murak checking the wagon's harness in the square and delivered his apology with visible discomfort, and Murak, to his evident relief, accepted it with the same flat grace she brought to most things, offering him a nod that seemed to settle something in the big man's shoulders. "No hard feelings, then," Brogan said. "Though I'll be telling that story till I die, I expect. Never seen anything like it." "Few have," Murak said, and there was a note of dry humor in it that made Brogan laugh, some of his earlier wariness finally dissolving into genuine warmth. By the time they left Frost Hollow, the settlement's earlier suspicion had transformed into something like local legend, the story of the orc who lifted the impossible axle already being retold with growing exaggeration by trappers heading south. And Matthew found himself, more than once, having to gently correct claims that Murak had lifted an entire wagon or bent a smith's anvil with her bare hands, though he suspected privately that she probably could have, had the occasion demanded it. The final stretch of the journey toward Greyfang Ridge was the most dangerous, the trail narrowing to a single icy track along a cliff face with a sheer drop on one side and jagged rock on the other, wide enough for the wagon but leaving no room for error. Matthew had made this stretch of the journey twice before, in better seasons, and even then it had unsettled him deeply. In the depths of winter, with ice glazing every surface and the wind howling down off the peaks with enough force to stagger a grown man, it was, without question, the most perilous journey of his life. They lost a full day to a sudden squall that forced them to shelter in a shallow cave, huddled together beneath every fur they carried, sharing warmth as much as necessity. And Matthew found, in the enforced closeness of that shelter, that Murak's presence made even the howling terror of the storm bearable, her steady breathing beside him, a rhythm he anchored himself to as the wind screamed outside. "Tell me about your clan," he said during a lull in the storm, when the silence between them had stretched long enough that he sensed she might, finally, be willing to fill it. Murak was quiet for a long moment, staring at the small fire they had risked building near the cave mouth. "My clan was proud," she said finally. "Proud in the old way, the way that curdles into cruelty if left untended. My father was clan chief. He believed the old wars with humans had never truly ended, only paused, and he raised his warriors to believe the same. I was his finest duelist. His pride, he called me, though I came to understand later that he meant his weapon, not his daughter." "What happened?" "There was a human settlement 3 years back that my father decided had encroached too far into clan hunting grounds. He ordered a raid. Not a battle, Matthew. A raid on farmers and their families, meant to send a message rather than fight a war." Her jaw tightened, old grief and old anger warring in her expression. "I refused the order. My father called it cowardice. I called it murder wearing a warrior's face. We fought, he and I, in the old dueling way for the right to decide the matter." She fell silent for a long moment. "I won. But winning meant I had broken clan law by challenging the chief directly, and I could not stay after, even having won, without the challenge tearing the clan apart into factions. So I left. Alone. And I have not returned since." Matthew reached for her hand in the firelight, threading his fingers through hers. "You saved those farmers." "I saved them that day," Murak said. "I do not know what became of them after, or whether my father found some other way to send his message once I was gone. That not knowing is a weight I have carried 3 years now. Would you go back, if you could? To my clan, no. That door is closed, and I do not regret closing it." She turned to look at him then, her golden eyes bright in the firelight. "But I have wondered sometimes whether there might be a place for me somewhere that is not my clan and not entirely human either. Somewhere between the two, the way I have felt myself to be since I left." "Kelder's Rest has orcs settled among the humans now," Matthew said carefully. "Frost Hollow, too, we saw that ourselves. It's not the old world anymore, Murak. Not everywhere. There's room being made slowly for people like you to have a place that isn't just wilderness and wandering. Room being made by people like you," Murak said, "who do not flinch at what I am, and do not require me to be less than I am to be welcome." "I don't want you to be anything but exactly what you are," Matthew said. I fell for the woman who fixed my axle with her bare hands and laughed at my terrible jokes. I'm not looking for anyone smaller than that. Murak leaned across the small fire and kissed him, slow and deep. And when the storm finally broke the following morning, they emerged from the cave into blinding, snow-bright sunlight to find the trail ahead clear, at least for now, of any obstacle but the mountain itself. They reached Greyfang Ridge 4 days later, the Orc settlement sprawling across a wide sheltered valley between two peaks, hide tents and stone longhouses mingling in a community larger and more permanent than Matthew had expected, smoke rising from dozens of fires into the pale winter sky. The clan here, led by an aging matriarch named Threska, greeted their arrival with evident relief. The salt and spice Matthew's wagon carried desperately needed after months without a successful supply run reaching them. Threska herself came out to meet the wagon, a stooped but sharp-eyed orc woman wrapped in thick furs, her gaze sweeping over Matthew with the assessing suspicion of someone who had seen too many human traders disappoint her people before, and then settling on Murak with a different kind of scrutiny entirely. "Ashwalker," Threska said, and there was recognition in the name that surprised Matthew. "Word travels even to this valley, girl. They say you lifted the Frost Hollow axle over your head like a child's toy." "Word exaggerates little for once," Murak said, "and they say you travel now with a human trader protecting his salt run through renegade country." Threska's eyes moved between them with obvious calculation. "Ashwalker blood does not typically choose such company." "Ashwalker blood chooses what it chooses," Murak said evenly, "and answers to no one for it any longer. Not clan law, not old pride. Only itself." Threska studied her for a long moment, then, unexpectedly, laughed, a dry rasping sound. "Good. Your father's pride nearly broke this whole mountain range in half before you left." Glad to see his daughter found something worth more than his approval, she turned to the gathered crowd of clan members already unloading the wagon with evident relief and gratitude. This human brought salt through renegade country in the dead of winter, with only an Ashwalker at his side for protection. That is either great courage or great foolishness, and I have learned the two often travel together in the men worth knowing. The clan welcomed them with genuine warmth, feasting them that night in the largest of the stone longhouses, and Matthew found himself, for the first time in his life, seated among orcs not as a wary trader conducting careful business, but as something closer to an honored guest, the story of the Frost Hollow axle and the defeated renegade band already circulating among the clan with evident approval. It was here, in the warm fire-lit longhouse, surrounded by Murak's people rather than his own, that Matthew finally understood the full shape of what she had given up in leaving her clan, and what she might perhaps be finding a way back toward now, not as her father's weapon, but as her own woman, choosing her own path and her own companion. "They like you," Murak observed quietly, as they sat together near the longhouse fire, watching clan children chase each other between the support posts. "I think they like that you're happy," Matthew said. "I think that matters more to them than anything about me specifically." "Perhaps," Murak agreed. "Though I suspect they also appreciate that you did not flinch when Threska tested you with her stare. Many humans do. I've had 3 years of practice not flinching at orc women who matter to me," Matthew said, and Murak's answering smile was soft enough to steal the breath from his lungs. They stayed a full week at Greyfang Ridge, longer than Matthew's usual trading stops allowed. But the clan's gratitude and Threska's evident interest in maintaining good relations with a trader willing to brave the pass in winter made the extended visit both welcome and practically useful. Matthew struck a standing arrangement with Threska for future supply runs, better terms than he had ever managed to negotiate before, the clan matriarch clearly viewing him now as something more trustworthy than the ordinary run of southern traders. It was on their last night at Greyfang Ridge, walking together along the ridge path above the valley, the northern sky above them thick with more stars than Matthew had ever seen gathered in one place, that Murak stopped him with a hand on his chest and said the words that would shape the rest of both their lives. "I want to stay with you," she said. "Not merely for this journey or the next one. I mean I want to build a life with you, Matthew Boone. Kelder's Rest, or somewhere else entirely, I do not care which, so long as it is a life we build together." "I want that too," Matthew said, his voice unsteady with the weight of wanting it. "I've wanted that since a whiteout 3 years ago, if I'm honest, though I didn't dare hope for it until you lowered your blade in that dueling circle." "Then let us stop merely wanting it," Murak said, "and begin it instead." They sealed the promise beneath that vast northern sky with a kiss that felt, to both of them, like the true beginning of everything that would follow. And when they returned to Kelder's Rest 2 weeks later, the wagon empty of salt but heavy with furs and resin and the clan's goodwill, they returned not merely as trading partners, but as something the whole outpost would soon come to recognize as a settled pair, bound to each other in every way that mattered. The return journey was not without its own dangers. A second encounter with renegades near the same narrow canyon tested them once more, though this time word of the Frost Hollow axle and the earlier defeat had clearly reached the raiders, and they scattered at the mere sight of Murak dismounting from her pony rather than risk a repeat engagement. A sudden ice storm cost them 2 days of shelter in a half-collapsed watchtower, its stone walls a poor but adequate shield against the worst of the wind, and Matthew spent those 2 days learning more of Murak's old life, of duels fought and won across 3 winters of solitary wandering, of the loneliness she had carried and never quite named until she found herself, against all expectation, no longer alone. "I did not know," she admitted during their second night in the watchtower, "how heavy that loneliness had grown until I set it down. I had told myself for 3 years that solitude was simply the price of the freedom I had won by leaving my clan. I did not understand it was possible to have both the freedom and the company until you. I spent 6 years hauling salt through mountain passes telling myself the same thing," Matthew said. "That solitude was just the trade's price. Turns out I was wrong too." They reached Kelder's Rest on a clear, bitterly cold morning, the outpost's log walls rising familiar and welcome against the pale winter sky, and Havard himself came out from the trading post to greet them, his skeptical expression from their departure replaced by open astonishment at the volume and quality of goods the wagon carried back. "6 years I've watched traders come back from that run half-frozen and empty-handed more often than not," Havard said, shaking his head as he inspected the furs and resin. "You two didn't just survive it, you thrived on it. Whatever arrangement you've struck, Boone, I want in on the next run." "There'll be a next run," Matthew said, glancing at Murak, who stood beside him with her arms crossed in an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Regular ones if Threska's clan and I have our way. And Murak rides every one of them with me." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Havard said, grinning, and it struck Matthew, watching the outpost's people move about their business without the wariness that might once have greeted an orc woman walking openly through their streets, that something had shifted in Kelder's Rest during their absence, some quiet acceptance built on the story of what they had accomplished together on the road. They settled that winter into a small cabin on the edge of the outpost, a modest building Matthew had been slowly improving for years without quite knowing why he bothered, given how often he was away on the trail. Now, with Murak beside him, the cabin took on a different purpose entirely, becoming not merely a place to store his goods between runs but a true home, its hearth kept warm through the long dark nights by both fire and company. There were, of course, some in the outpost who never fully warmed to the sight of an orc woman living openly with a human trader, old prejudices dying hard even in a settlement more accustomed to mixed company than most, but their disapproval remained mostly muttered and distant, unwilling to test itself against the reputation Murak had built through the Frost Hollow axle and the defeated renegade band, and unwilling, too, to risk the disapproval of a community that had come, through 6 years of Matthew's honest trading, to consider him one of their own. The winter deepened, the nights growing longer still, but Matthew found he no longer minded the darkness the way he once had, because it meant longer hours beside the hearth with Murak, sharing bowls of stew that had, by now, become something of a private joke between them, a callback to that first shared meal in a supply shack 3 winters gone. She taught him words of the old Orc tongue, and he taught her the small human customs of the outpost, the songs sung at the Crooked Antler on quiet evenings, the particular way Havard liked his ledgers organized, the careful courtesies expected at the outpost's occasional gatherings. She never fully lost the wariness her years of solitary dueling had bred into her, the sharp awareness of exits and weapons that marked every room she entered. But around Matthew, that wariness eased into something softer, a woman who had found, at last, a place where she did not need to keep her guard raised every waking moment. "I used to think," she told him one night as they lay together beneath their shared furs, the fire burned low, "that I would spend my whole life as I found myself after leaving my clan. Alone, moving from outpost to outpost, dueling for coin, belonging nowhere in particular. I had made peace with that future, or told myself I had. And now?" Matthew asked, though he already knew the answer, wanted only to hear her say it. "Now I have a home," Murak said, "and a man who laughs at my terrible jokes as readily as I laugh at his, and I find I do not miss the old future in the slightest." She turned to face him fully, her golden eyes soft in the firelight. "You gave me that, Matthew Boone, simply by laughing at the right moment, in a dueling circle, on an ordinary cold evening that turned out to be the least ordinary evening of my life." "You gave me the same thing," Matthew said. "I spent 6 years telling myself I didn't need anyone, that the trail was enough, that a laugh shared once in a supply shack was just a nice memory and nothing more. Turns out I was wrong about that too. We are both, it seems," Murak said, "fools who did not know what we needed until it walked back into our lives. Good thing we're the same kind of fool then." She laughed at that, the sound warm and unguarded in the small cabin, and Matthew thought, as he had thought many times since that first afternoon in the dueling circle, that he would spend the rest of his life finding new ways to earn that laugh, again and again, for as long as he was given breath to do it. Spring came slowly to Kelder's Rest, the snow retreating in reluctant stages up the mountain slopes, the Ashgrave River breaking free of its ice with a series of thunderous cracks that echoed through the outpost for days. Matthew began preparing for the season's first full trading run, and this time there was no question of whether Murak would accompany him. She had already begun sharpening her falchion, checking her bow string, examining the wagon's axles with the same thoroughness she had shown a full season before, when she had been, technically, still only a woman he had recognized across a dueling circle rather than the woman who shared his hearth, his bed, and every plan he made for the future. "You've gone quiet," Murak observed, watching him from across the cabin as he packed the last of the trade goods. "Just thinking," Matthew said, "how strange it is. A year ago I was making this same run alone, telling myself I preferred it that way because it was easier than admitting how much I hated the silence. And now I can't imagine doing it any other way." He crossed the small room and pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, resting her forehead against his. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for lowering your blade that day, for recognizing my laugh instead of just hearing noise from a crowd. I know it seems a small thing, but it changed everything for me." "It was not small," Murak said. "I have thought of that moment many times since. How close I came to never knowing you were even in that crowd if I had finished the duel a heartbeat sooner. How close I came to walking away from a whole life I did not yet know I wanted." She pulled back slightly to look at him properly. "I do not believe in fate, Matthew Boone. My people have old stories of it, threads woven by unseen hands, but I have always thought it more likely that a person simply chooses, again and again in each small moment, whether to reach toward what matters or let it pass by. I chose to stop my blade. I have been glad of that choice every day since. I'm glad you're the kind of woman who stops her blade for a laugh, Matthew said. I am glad, Murex said, that you are the kind of man worth stopping it for. They left Kelder's Rest 3 days later on the season's first run, the mountain trail thick with mud rather than snow, the air carrying the first hints of thaw. And though the pass remained as dangerous as ever, populated by the same possibility of renegades and hard weather that had shadowed every journey before, Matthew found he no longer felt the old solitary dread that had once accompanied every departure. Beside him rode Murak Ashwalker, her falchion at her hip, her golden eyes scanning the tree line with practiced vigilance. And behind them, waiting, was a home that had not existed a year before, built from nothing more than a laugh recognized across a crowded dueling circle and a blade lowered in the space of a single held breath. The road ahead remained long, and the mountains remained as rugged and unforgiving as they had always been. But Matthew Boone no longer walked it alone, and Murak Ashwalker no longer wandered without a place to return to. And between the two of them, whatever the past demanded, whatever renegades or storms or old prejudices still lingered in the outposts along the way, they would face it together, as they had faced everything since the moment her blade had stopped an inch from a stranger's throat and found. Instead, the sound of a laugh she would have known anywhere in the world. They made camp that first night in the same rocky outcropping where they had sheltered on their very first journey together, and as the fire crackled between them and the mountain stars wheeled slow and bright overhead, Murak reached across the small distance separating them and took Matthew's hand in hers, her grip strong and certain and utterly without hesitation. "Whatever comes," she said, "on this run or any after it, know that I chose this. I choose it still. I will go on choosing it." "So will I," Matthew said, and meant it more completely than he had ever meant anything in his life. The dawn came slow and pale over the mountains the next morning, gilding the frost-rimed pines in soft gold light, and as they broke camp and continued north together, wagon wheels creaking over the thawing trail, there was no storm left to weather, no crowd left to silence, no old grief or old prejudice strong enough to stand between them any longer. There was only the road ahead, and the two of them walking it together, exactly as they meant to go on, for as long as the mountain stood and the seasons turned, and long, long after.